behalf of the Joan Shorenstein Barone Center on the Press, Politics and Public Policy, welcome everyone to this forum on Tiananmen Square 2 years later. How did the media perform? The forum comes in conjunction with the evolution of a draft report on this subject following a 2-year study by a research team at the Barone Center. In a cell in Beijing, there were 3 male prisoners sitting on stools in a row, and the one in the middle said to his neighbor, "What are you in here for?" And he said, "Well, I called Deng Xiaoping a great revolutionary, but Mao had decided that he was actually a counter-revolutionary." The prisoner in the middle turned to the prisoner on his other side and said, "Well, what are you here for?" "Well, my case is different. I called Deng Xiaoping a counter-revolutionary, but the Communist Party decided that after all he was a great revolutionary." A silence, and then the prisoner who'd been asked the question first turned it back on the prisoner in the center who'd originated the question. "You yourself, what are you in here for?" "I'm Deng Xiaoping." So China changes, and we change in our perception of China. Did China nearly change fundamentally in 1989? Can China change? And has the media become a key ingredient in what happens or doesn't happen in world affairs? At times our media seems a bit strange to Chinese. I had a visitor from Beijing recently. We switched on the World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. And Sam Donaldson's face appeared just as my friend said, "I've always wanted to see Peter Jennings." And I said, "Sorry, well, actually, that's Sam Donaldson." And she said, "But it says World News Tonight with Peter Jennings." And I said, "Well, it is Mr. Donaldson." And Sam came back, bulldozing his way through the news of the evening. And my friend said, "Well, why don't they call it World News Tonight without Peter Jennings?" In the spring of 1989, the whole world watched as Chinese students, with great dedication and courage and facing much danger, protested in the streets of Beijing and 80 other Chinese cities and towns, stunning the government of Deng Xiaoping, disrupting a Sino-Soviet summit, winning wide support and melding an anti-government movement for major change, then in the end put down on the night of June 3rd, 4, and repressed thereafter. June 4, for those of us in Beijing, called into question much about China. For the participants, one of whom is on our panel and others in the audience, the tanks, the bullets, the smoke, the anger were a matter of life and death or prison. Beyond the tragedy, the Beijing Spring was a universal moment as young China cried out its concerns, and Americans and others recognized that cry as one for freedom and democracy. That night on Chang'an Street, I heard a Chinese man cry out to no one in particular, "Tell the world our government has gone mad." The American media indeed told the world this and much else about China. My pedicab driver that night said, "Were the Martin Luther King demonstrations like that? Did you have as many people in the streets as we saw here tonight during those demonstrations? And just before dawn, when I took my leave of him, he said, "You know, I carried the students for free." And something made me ask him why, and he said, because they were doing something. When the shots came that early morning of June 4, for those of us who'd been often in China, it was only the sound of firecrackers that seemed to bring any memory of such a sound. Well, the Chinese government had done horrible things to its citizens before, in Tibet, in the Cultural Revolution, in labor camps, but never before in front of a world audience. Seldom had the American press been plunged into a story so gripping, so unexpected in its twists, so consequential for the relation between two of the world's major nations. The rule book had to be written as day succeeded day. The volume and the immediacy of the coverage ensured that it would be a major factor in the formulation of American public opinion and of foreign policy toward China. And the event, as well as its coverage, had a major effect on Chinese society, Chinese politics, and Chinese foreign policy. The final truth about the Beijing Spring and its terrible ending is not yet established, and it may never be. Nor is the Sino-American relationship a static phenomenon, but rather a constantly evolving one, and perhaps a very resilient one. Among the questions still difficult to resolve is the role of the media. The report which the Barone Centre now has in draft finds a lot of strengths in the coverage. There were journalists with better background than ever before in covering China, with an open-mindedness toward China and its complexities that contrasted with the simple-minded anti-communism of the 50s and the 60s, and also with the rather starry-eyed awe that marked some of the coverage in the early 1970s. The media put fantastic resources into the China story. Bridges were built between the China events and ideas, images, traditions in America to make the story understandable. However, there are people in this country, many who are not always sanguine about the media in general. There were voices that said the press played too strong a role and that there were distortions. So if many in the press felt the China Spring was a fine hour, others said, media critics, some China scholars, officials of both the Chinese and the American government, that the distortions caused by the media prism had an unnaturally disruptive effect on public opinion and policy making in both countries. President Bush at Yale the other day sought to keep US-China ties from going off the tracks. We're not here tonight to debate the policies he's following to that end, but to look back on an event and a portrayal of that event that undoubtedly changed American-China relations and made it harder for Bush to do what he is trying to do. The draft report suggests some omissions and flaws in the media coverage, a thinness on the views of the movement held by Chinese peasants, on the role of senior intellectual advisors to the students, on the factionalism within the movement, on the uprisings in the 80-odd cities outside of Beijing. The report also suggests that government and academic specialists were sometimes far from prophetic in advice to the media. In many ways, it was a miracle of skill, perseverance, and organization that the media brought so much of that event, an unfolding drama in the heart of the most secretive major nation, into American living rooms, to make the American public care as much about the Chinese students as we came to do was itself a major achievement. I hope that the media drove home to the old men of the Chinese government that in resisting democracy, they fight an uphill struggle against the power of information across national borders. Above strengths and weaknesses, issues emerge from the coverage. Can the press be neutral? Did pictures remake American foreign policy toward China? And if so, should this have happened? Even more important, who was the media responding to during the Beijing Spring? Was the American public demanding this massive and unprecedented coverage? Did competition spur it? Was it the story itself that grew like a vine in the tropics and made its own space? Is the media today performing a role consciously of writing the first draft of history? Why was the Beijing Spring such a big story? Gorbachev's presence, the worldwide unraveling of the communist bloc and the soaring of democracy, the fascination of seeing a China that we hadn't seen before. Some would say it was a big story in part because the press had not prepared us for the repressive face of Deng Xiaoping. Does the media bring preconceptions to an international story such as the China one? How, 2 years later, do we disentangle the legacy of the event from the legacy of how the media portrayed the event? To look back on Tiananmen is to look back on a story of how China nearly changed. Did the media, foreign and Chinese, help bring China to the brink of that change? And next time, too, will the media be a part of whether change will occur? The questions crowd in, and some of the panel might also want to reflect on what the press can learn from the China story for coverage of China and other crises in the future. There are controversies here in the draft report and in the topic itself. Everyone is not going to agree, and it would be a bad sign if they did. Our first panelist is Susan Zierinski, a television journalist, senior broadcast producer of the CBS Evening News. During the 1988 pre-election year, she was a floor producer at the Democratic and Republican conventions and an election night producer. She's been at CBS since 1972, about the time when the remarkable relation between the PRC and the Republican Party entered its modern phase. In 1989, Susan oversaw the Beijing newsroom during CBS's China coverage. Susan Zierinski.
Thanks very much. You know, it's about 32 years ago, Edward R. Murrow, at the height of his influence, rose before a convention of broadcasters to speak out against the timidity of television at that point. And he warned that unless people were determined to use television for the betterment of mankind, it would be, and I quote, merely wires, lights in a box. So much has been made of our limitations and Murrow's dark vision that I think sometimes we forget that he had bright dreams of what television could be. And 2 years ago, I flew into Beijing on April 15th, the day that the first demonstrations began. And as I reflect on the coverage of China, I really come away reminded of what television can be and is sometimes. I've read the draft report, and I won't get into the specifics. I'll let Ross do that in questioning, but I apologize for nothing. I say that with a clear conscience. I found television to be a teaching tool, illuminating. It inspired the world. It was a weapon against ignorance, intolerance, and indifference. For months, reporters of all the networks brought Beijing's battle for what they called democracy, and I use that phrase carefully, to the hearts and lips of Main Street. They demonstrated the medium's extraordinary power to make students who live on the other side of the planet just as human, just as vulnerable as the boy on the next block. The miracle of television was that the tragedy at Tiananmen Square would not have been any more vivid than had it been in Times Square. What I had come to do was really run the operation for CBS for the Gorbachev visit. It was the first visit of anyone from that country in 30 years. It was an enormous event. That is why CBS was in China. That is why the Chinese government granted us 60-some-odd visas. I hope Larry Tisch isn't listening. We had a small bureau in place in Beijing, tiny, a camera crew, a reporter, a translator. What we built there, not anticipating the demonstrations, but anticipating the Gorbachev visit, was a small army of technicians, reporters, producers, as well as enough equipment to really create a global village that Marshall McLuhan would have been impressed with. We immediately began covering the demonstrations, having really no sense that this would become a great movement and take on the significance that it did. But as we covered the streets, we were negotiating for sending teams out to the rest of the country for the Gorbachev visit to tell people where was China at, what did its people want, where were they as a society. We talked about them moving towards a democracy. This is the Gorbachev visit, which I considered really became a footnote to the major story, which was the student demonstrations. The student movement, which really took on a life of its own. It grew, as you used the term, it was a vine. It enveloped us. And was the world clamoring for more? It wasn't my purpose to determine what the world was clamoring for. I saw a story unfolding, and it was my job to give it to the world. Whether you are your own video police, if you will. If you don't want to watch it, you can turn it off. But it's my job as a journalist to cover what I think is an amazing story, as we saw that was happening in China. It became more and more evident as all of my people were out in the field and I found myself alone in Beijing with the world's largest crowds, that what was happening in China was not happening out in the countryside at that point. It was at Beida University in Tsinghua. And in the weeks before other CBS people came to cover it, the difficulty of reporting this story was enormous. Every government source that our bureau had fell silent. We were just beginning to build our student contacts. I became very friendly with Wu Kai-shi, who at one point wasn't even allowed into the hotel to see me. I had to go out on the street to get him as the situation became tense. Our operation grew. Teams came back into Beijing. Dan Rather moved into Beijing, and the story grew in terms of its significance. We now had, a lot more people to cover it. We were not all experts on China. We had a staff person there. We even tried to recruit Harry. I took him out for a very nice lunch. It didn't work, unfortunately. We hired Betty Val Lord, wife of Winston Lord, the ambassador, who was leaving, and his ambassadorship was over, so she was able to come in. It was very helpful to us to have what we thought was an inside track. Even her sources shut down. Even her sources were feeding her misinformation. That was our job to kind of go through the volume of rhetoric and try and discern what was truth and what was not. The impact of television was monumental. I recognize that. It hit many different sides. It hit the students, it hit the general world population, Chinese, American governments, and for us in television. Did we incite the demonstrations by being there? I don't think so. I will admit there was comfort for the students that we were recording events. The students knew the coverage was getting enormous play worldwide. They talked to us. They asked us about it. We told them. But would the demonstrations have gone on to the extent that they did without world press on every corner? I can't answer that. I just can't answer it. It was a story in the beginning which wherever we walked, on any street, we were swallowed by 20 or 30 people grabbing at our credentials and seeing where we were and who we were. There was a night after martial law was declared and the government had ordered troops into Beijing, into Tiananmen Square, only to be frustrated and really humiliated by the thousands of people and the citizens of Beijing. We wanted to get back in the square, and so everybody piled into the car to the one driver who I will never tell you how much I paid him to take the risk of driving us around at 1 in the morning. The government had, of course, declared a curfew. People were pulling buses in the roadway, letting air out of the tires. They pulled guardrails and paving stones, anything to block the intersections so that they thought they could stop the tanks. When we got to the intersections, people would surround our cars, and the driver would explain, we were Americans, we were television journalists, and they began to applaud and scream and throw food in the car. People were dumbfounded. I welcomed the food, of course. People were absolutely dumbfounded that we were disobeying martial law, that we were courageous enough to be out there covering it. They had thought all the foreign broadcasters had been kicked out of China. I believe it was good we were there. I believe that the government's initial restraint was due not only to the internal power struggles that the report talks about, but the pressure of the world watching, the pressure of not wanting to lose face in front of an entire universe, the pressure of standing tall during what was to be supposedly a historic visit. We should have been nowhere else. The students believed, and I say this from my heart, that it was only necessary that representatives of the free press be present and that the world know that they were there. They may have been naive. It was dangerous and for some fatal. But the young men and women in Tiananmen Square really held an unshakable faith in the words, "The truth shall make you free." I think the true impact of television was felt more for us after the government shut down television pictures. We took to shipping videotape by pigeons out on airplanes to Tokyo and Hong Kong. We even used a video fax machine, sending still frames of our video when we couldn't make a shipment. The goddess of democracy first appeared on American television through use of a video fax machine. We learned that someone had been arrested after they had spoken out to an American television network. This was post-Tiananmen night, about the demonstrations and the number of dead. That meant that the Chinese authorities had actually taken a satellite feed from outside the country, had taken it and replayed it within China and said, this person is destructive to our society. Who is he? Somebody dutifully turned him in and he was sentenced to 10 years. It was at that moment that we realized, and so did the people in China, the very chilling meaning of a global village. The impact was devastating to us. It was that moment that we formally declared among, and I have a colleague in the audience, David Caravello, we got together as a group and decided, even if somebody is willing to be identified, we will not identify anybody by face. We will interview them from behind. What happened was China was returning back to fear of foreigners, fear of retribution, fear of life. The people that cheered us being there after martial law shut down. The impact of television was felt not only within the Chinese and within the government, but my industry itself. This wasn't Vietnam. Tape pieces weren't being shipped in. We were bringing you a revolution, and I call it a revolution, live in your living rooms. It wasn't as if we could determine what was going to happen next. We were along the ride, and we were taking the American audiences along with us. It was after the Tiananmen Square that we really redefined how we do television. Berlin Wall fell live on television. Bombs over Baghdad live. Scud missiles in Israel live. The liberation of Kuwait. My crew got in there before the Americans did. It is a new universe, and this brings questions to us and more in terms of China, what our responsibility is. Do we risk lives? Are we risking national security? How are we influencing policy? But all along, it was impossible for us at that moment to shut down television. I think as I look back, the final bloody denouement, if you will, of China's student uprising had an ending that was tragic, no matter what perspective you looked at it from. It was tragic for the students who were wounded and killed, tragic for the government who killed them, and tragic for the world that China had once again been thrown into a brink of chaos. I can only speak for myself and the contingent of CBS covering the events. We learned a great deal. Some of our own people risked their lives to cover the story. But as I went to cover the war in the Gulf, the lessons of China were with me every moment. I crossed this out. I had written it last night, but I'll tell it if I'm still in my time frame. No. You know, the old men who really clutch at the reins of power can repeat over and over that the 27th Army was attacked by criminals, and that the world really knows better what was seen and what truly happened. It knows from the students that were there, and it won't forget the blood, whether the blood was on Tiananmen Square or on Chang'an Avenue or in the hall that was a block away. We saw it. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan Zierinski. I think you can all see our names. My name is Ross Terrell, which I should have mentioned before. Our second speaker is on my right, Mr. Shen Tong, who was a leader in the student democracy movement. He's a native of Beijing and a graduate of Beijing University, and he has just graduated from Brandeis a week ago in biology. His book, Almost a Revolution, is a very moving account of his upbringing and of his participation in the student democracy movement of 1989. Shen Tong served for a time as the movement's liaison with the foreign press. He's at present, as well as preparing to be a graduate student, chairman of the Democracy for China Fund. Shen Tong.
Dr. Taro and Susan's speech made me very emotional because it's just, exactly two years ago, exactly the same day, and it was our goddess democracy, the first day of that goddess on Tiananmen Square. So when you mentioned about the video facts, it was it's very emotional to me. But I will try to stick to my duty, talk about the topic today for me. Basically, I will focus on two parts. One is during our consideration on the foreign press role during the movement in 1989 spring, and 2 years later now, looking back to the period. At that time, I would just do it, since the time consideration, I would just do it, sort of time by time. In the very beginning, I was elected as one of the 5 committee members of the Student Autonomous Federation for Beijing University, and then Beijing, and then we had network across the country. And part of our duties, naturally, though we didn't think of, is to deal with foreign press, like Suzanne and other people. So in the beginning, it was just neutral. We find little difficulties there, the language difficulties, and since a lot of reporters were there covering the Gorbachev visit, they don't know China, frankly, and they don't really speak the language, as they couldn't even find an intern quick enough to translate. So, that's why that's the reason I stick to my duty for a long time at that time, because I spoke relatively better English than a lot of other students. But when we started to do more, when the movement started to go along, like for my part, I was in charge of the liaison and public relations, printing, newspaper, and radio station, all based in my dorm, basically. We find a very powerful feedback from the foreign coverage on our movement, and it's sort of amazing feedback system that we are doing something in Beijing, and it's just feedback through VOA, BBC, and other network TVs that Chinese people have access to, like CNN and others. And people know immediately what's going on. And I, since I was liaison not only for foreign press, but also for the other cities, movement leaders, student representative, they talked about events, they talked about the strategic planning we put out. Even some, not really open public meetings, it was covered by foreign press, and they were talking about that. So it's very impressive, and we start to pay attention to this part. And before, actually I skipped one of the part I prepared since the time. Before the movement, we were mainly focusing on the Chinese press, not only for the coverage, it's different idea, Chinese press and this country's press. With Chinese press, we were not trying to make noise through cameras and newspaper. What we were trying to do is really to let them stand on their own feet. But now, we find this powerful, real free press, though a little awkward. You go outside and come back, but it's as powerful, and it's much more powerful than the Chinese press. So we start to considering the cooperation with them. At that time, though that's an interesting point, no American journalist was constantly in my room, but there were Hong Kong, British, like BBC reporters and the French reporters. They were there as a consultant to me. They would tell me how to deal with the questions during the press conference and how to take the opportunities to make some news and keep the story rolling, as one of the BBC reporters said. And you have to keep the story rolling. So that was quite an amazing phrase for me. So we were actually cooperating. I talked about this once in the Fairbanks Center in Harvard, and the response from American reporters afterwards is quote unquote scary, because they don't consider that as a real journalist. I don't know, your opinions here, but that's actually happened. And give you another extreme example. I wouldn't name the news agency, though very prominent worldwide. They told me, actually that night when Wu Kaixi and Wang Dan went to the Shanghai hotel for the CBS interview, I was there because I was the liaison officer. So the couple of very prominent journalists, not American journalists, told me, you guys got to look at the May 15th, There will be thousands of foreign correspondents, major correspondents in Beijing. All the cameras here, and you've got to make something there. So if you can survive that long, that was April 22 or something. If you can survive that long,
memory.
You've got to make something. I wrote a book, So.
I now remember this story, I'm afraid to say.
Yeah. So that's just example. Let me just run through it. I'm taking too long time. Looking back to that event, I think the most important thing I can contribute here is not to talk about the success, but the failure of the movement from my perspective. One thing is I find, from my personal feeling, I often talk about this, that there are two Tiananmen squares. One is the one I was there, there was excitement, frustration, and hesitation, and then the bloody night. Everything never leaves the heart of a social revolution. The other is the perception of the American world, not only American people, but worldwide. I find overwhelming when I came out of China, the Tiananmen Square, or the student in front of the tango, God of democracy, how powerful they were, and how powerful they are still. In different languages, you talk about square, plaza, whatever. People recognize it immediately. And though they don't know China, probably one of the amazing things I find in Kansas City is an old lady, American lady, find a group of Japanese students, and she asked them, were you in Tiananmen Square? That did happen, and it happened a lot, actually. So you can see the power of that. I wouldn't say majority of Americans do that, but the second Tiananmen Square I'm referring to is really quite different from the first one I lived through, and it's hard to describe in one sentence. Let me go through three categories. One is that there are a lot of really important events was not covered. Those Susan mentioned a lot of reasons, but still, talking about the press coverage. For example, I give you very simple examples. Important issues like the campus activities before the movement, which is very important and very much shaped the strategic planning in the very beginning and influenced later part of the movement in Beijing and all across the country. And the second example is the early agenda was not really covered, though the Chinese students across the country, student activists in all the major cities, they knew what we were talking about. In our press conference, when we announced it, like the whole year's planning, and then later I came to this country, I find out people were asking that you never provided any plan from the very beginning to all the way to the end. I find that very frustrating. And the third example is like a very important, historically important moment for most of the participants of the 1989 movement was May 13th and 14th dialogue with the government. It was very little covered by the American press. This is just the three examples. The second area, the second category is geographically, it was majorly in Beijing. Even, I mean, the most dramatic moment is the massacre. People referring to Tiananmen massacre. It happened at least in 10 cities across the country. I mean, it happened more brutally in other cities, though Beijing was under the camera. So that's the second category. The third category is, about the Tiananmen Square. Actually, I mentioned the second one. During the movement, the cameras were focusing there. And there were a lot of very important activities, behind the scene negotiation, new leadership emerged, planning of the movement after the massacre happened. It was expected, massacre kind of thing. We built up printing, second ring road printing, third ring road printing. It's not covered at all. I mean, all the cameras was still in Tiananmen Square. They actually set up a camera there. So, from one hand, I'm talking about the press coverage. On the other hand, it really make it turn to a drama, because other student leaders emerge later knows where to play, I mean, literally. So they go there and they make dramatic speeches, and the center wasn't anymore as that monument. It was distributed in the campuses across Beijing and then all over the country. And in Beijing, the center decentralized to the suburb, to the at least surrounding of the downtown area. Anyway, after the movement is the same thing. For example, the most arguable issue about the massacre itself. Actually, I understand Chinese government was trying to mislead the foreign press, and the foreign press unfortunately followed. They all talk about how many people died in Tiananmen Square. How did they really shoot or not? That's not the important issue. And a lot of press was there. They know there are a lot of people died right in front of them in Xidan, in Muxudi, on the west part of the Chang'an Avenue, Eternal Peace Avenue, in downtown Beijing. And all the world was focusing, the press was focusing on Tiananmen Square. For me, that's pointless, and I wouldn't go on to argue about that. So I probably, what I'm talking about sounds like I'm asking a superb power or social opinion to really look at all the aspects of the movement. I understand press itself has its own focus and its own pace, but it's from my personal point of view, it makes our life from a personal level quite hard after I came out of China. When I mentioned before the two Tiananmen Squares, and also it have certain consequences, because people look at this movement, people look at people like me and like Wu Kai-shi in a very different view, and put them in a very difficult situation, and a lot of you realized what the consequences this country's press to certain exile political activists. It was not very pleasant. And the second one is the reflection of the movement. I'm really glad to attend this panel. When Dr. Taro called me about this report, I'm so glad to see something like that came out, because frankly, I would say the reflection of the coverage of that such an important historic event was very shallow in this country's English press. Even the Chinese press, though I wouldn't say it's very deep over the 2 years, but the gap between the Chinese language press and the English press in this country is so far away. It's so amazing to me. They just don't pick it up. They just don't pick up the news, the accurate news. I mean, I wouldn't say they don't pick up at all, but to a certain degree, that surprised me. And also the press focus, I mean, over the last 2 years, right after Tiananmen Square, I talked about the overwhelming feelings, but meanwhile, you see Eastern Europeans, South Africa, and then most recently Persian Gulf, and the focus was completely moved away. And Chinese authority didn't waste any time of that. They put all the major dissidents on trial in January, when this country all looking at the Persian Gulf crisis. And fortunately, recently, the MFN, Most Favored Nation status issue came out, the forced labors and trade deficit, weapon sales, and in a way, I should thank President Bush make his speech in New Haven, as his commencement speech for Yale University, to grant unconditionally the MFN status for China, and it bring the China on focus again. So I hope this can have a good start and people can look at China more carefully. I think the bottom line we're looking at is this is not only for press but also for people like me, political activists and observers of China politics. The bottom line should be we at least see the general picture in a way that next time this kind of event come out, it will not be, I hope, as a surprise as big as the one it was. Thank you.
Thank you, Shentong. Jeff Sommer is a newspaper correspondent and editor. He is at present foreign editor of Newsday. Jeff has degrees from Cornell, Columbia, and Harvard. His awards include the Overseas Press Club's Hal Boyle Award for his reporting from India. He's been Newsday's bureau chief in Moscow, and he spent the spring and summer of 1989 reporting from China. Jeff Sommer.
Yes, I was going to begin this, in any case, by professing humility and acknowledging from the outset that most of us, I think most practitioners of the craft of journalism recognize that we almost never get everything right, that this is a goal that we will keep pushing for, but that we never quite make it. Now, Shentong has just pointed out how off some of us were. You know, there was clearly a need in the coverage of Tiananmen Square for skepticism, not only about the Chinese government, not only about the American government, but also about the student movement and the manipulation of the media, or an effort to manipulate the media that was being done by the students. Most of us who were covering the event, I think I can say safely, were overwhelmingly sympathetic to the student movement, and in some cases we identified with it. I had been based in Beijing from '83 to '86 and had studied Chinese for years before, including here at Harvard. And I think there are other people in this audience who've had similar experiences, who've been based in China, and I hope that if what I'm saying is not your own experience, you'll point that out at the end of this. But I think that for those of us who had spent time studying China before going over, we tended to find it a very emotional experience, because China is a very, as Tiananmen Square points out, I guess quite clearly, China is a very rough place, and can be a very rough place. It can be a heartbreaking place if you're sympathetic. I think that played a role in the coverage of Tiananmen Square. For many of us, when we saw the student movement develop, and we saw the crowds develop, when we began to find that people in the streets were speaking to us in a more open way than had ever been true before, when people were really, a lot of ordinary people were beginning to come out and say that they weren't afraid anymore, they didn't care about the consequences. All of this had a tremendous impact, I think, emotionally. I think this was conveyed in the coverage, and it was worthwhile that it was conveyed. I think that the subjective reality of the experience was quite overwhelming, but I suspect that there perhaps was a need for all of us to have struggled, perhaps more than we did. We all struggled, I think, many of us, but struggled more than we did to be skeptical. I do think, and I come from a different perspective than Susan. Obviously, I'm a print journalist. I've always been a print journalist, and I look at things a little bit differently. I do think that the Tiananmen experience, the Tiananmen coverage, was a kind of a turning point in terms of television impact on an international story, and we've seen similar developments and perhaps an expansion of this thing, in the Gulf War, with television beaming back images, beaming them back here, but beaming them out around the world and becoming an immediate source of information. Coming off some of the things that Shantung was saying, I too found, both when I came back, but also when I was in Beijing and going into my hotel room and watching CNN during the period when I could watch CNN, that a lot of what I was seeing on television really wasn't what I was experiencing. For example, the image, which I think many people here probably have, if you had to pick a symbol of Tiananmen Square, you'd probably think of this guy stopping the tanks. We didn't see that. It wasn't beamed back in China. If you talked to people on the streets in China about this, they didn't know that this particular thing happened. Now, I think that was a valid image, certainly. There's no question that it was a valid image, but it wasn't reality in China because people didn't see it. This is a benign example, but I think there are many others that are not so benign. I might. Perhaps this is I don't think this is terribly controversial, but I'll just say it, that I think that the development of the tendency to bring anchors overseas and have them anchor a story from the location, in my opinion, is absolutely silly. And I was as I say, I do speak the language, and I can recall. I won't identify what network this was. But I recall being in the square sometime in May, and one of a U.S. anchor was in the square and had no idea of what he was doing. And I was there. I essentially wanted to hear this, and I just kind of hung around. I was looking pretty grubby, and was trying to just listen. And a producer did a fine job of prepping this character, telling them, which way to stand and what to say, and I listened to the whole thing, and there were people standing around, Chinese folks, looking at this and being very amused and saying things in Chinese. This is incredible, look at this guy. And it went on. This is perhaps it's a snitty,
I'll get my chance later.
You'll get me later, I'm just, yeah. But I hope I'm not out of line in saying this, but I personally am troubled by it. I think, though, that we in print have been struggling in the last few years in ways of responding to the development of TV, which does do things that we can't possibly do. We in print are no longer delivering news very much of the time because the events are already back there. You see the events, but you don't quite know what they mean. You don't know what's happening. All this is bringing me to say that what I think. In terms of lessons coming from Tiananmen, to me the biggest lesson is the continuing overriding importance of the individual journalist who needs to be prepared probably years and years in advance. I mean, many years in advance, in order to have sufficient background to be able to grapple with an event as complicated as something like Tiananmen Square. If you don't speak the language and you don't understand what anyone is saying on the street, there's no way in hell that you're going to be able to adequately convey the story. Now, of course, you can't speak every language everywhere in the world, and there are parachutists who I think do a great job. But so what I'm saying is not just the language training, the background that people need to have done some time, paid some dues as reporters. And then I think we all need, if you have the background, you need to be very, very skeptical, and you need to do enterprise reporting. I'd gone back through our coverage, and I found that it is true that at Newsday we had not, I'm sure that we didn't adequately prepare the reader for the horrible denouement of Tiananmen Square, and yet there was reporting being done. The one story that I had filed that I'm proudest of now, I think, is a very small one that during a period in leading up to the massacre, for a while there was going out in the middle of the night, as many colleagues were. I see people here who were doing the same thing. Most of us got very little sleep, and I and others as well would make rounds at about 2 or 3 a.m. and see, are the tanks coming? Is there anything happening in the square? And I found that about 2 a.m. One morning, I'd come upon a barricade, and there was I was with a driver, and there was a kind of a mob scene, and someone was getting beaten up as I got close to it. And then the crowd came and surrounded my car, and they started pounding on the car, and they were trying to get at me. And then they realized that I looked the way I look. I'm clearly not Chinese. And I started explaining in Chinese that I'm an American reporter, what's going on. And then someone in the crowd said, well, that guy over there is an Army infiltrator. We've caught him, he's on reconnaissance, and these people want to kill him. Would you be willing to get him out of here because his life is in danger? And I said, certainly, of course. And some people took him and threw him in the car, and I took him away, and I interrogated him because he was quite nervous that I would just put him back out on the street. And he gave me a little scenario and said that he'd been sent in to kind of scope out what was going to happen. I asked him, did he really believe that the Army was going to go in? And he said, would the Army attack students? And he said, well, they wouldn't attack just students, but if they were engaged in counter-revolution, if they were engaged in rebellion, of course they will. And the orders, are in fact to do it. And we've got to figure out, how to get in. And all this was in the paper. We printed this. The problem was that I didn't believe it because I was overwhelmingly, involved in this thing, and I found that I just could not comprehend the reality of what was coming. I think that was true for many of us. I think we fell down on the analysis. But to me, the lesson is, stick with what you see, stick with what you know, stick with your background, stick with reporting, and and respect your craft, and you'll survive. Thanks.
In a few moments there will be a chance for questions. Before that time comes, our panel is nicely complemented by a final presentation from a China scholar. Harry Harding is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Spent many years at Stanford, where he took his PhD. He is the author of Organizing China and China's Second Revolution, and he has a forthcoming volume tentatively entitled Redesigning America-China Relations, which I suppose could be one of the epitaphs for June 4. Harry Harding.
Thank you, Ross. I apologize for standing between the panel and questions, but I'll try to be brief. I think that there are really two broad issues that I want to raise with you tonight. The first is the central issue of the Barone Center study, and that is how well did the American news media do in covering the crisis in China in 1989. And then secondly, the question that I grapple with all the time in dealing with contemporary U.S.-China relations, and that is, what difference does it make? Did press performance have a fundamental impact on American policy towards China and on the American-Chinese relationship? Let me deal briefly with each of these questions in turn. I should tell you, if I had more time, I'd deal with the third question, and that is the one that I personally was most involved with, and that has to do with the way in which the media interact with, I don't want to call them experts, let's call them specialists, academic specialists on a subject, but if you're interested, you can ask questions about that. I feel it's a little too close to home to spend the time to talk about it now. But dealing with the first question, how well did the press do? I think that the report indicates, in my own retrospective recollections of the time, is that the press did a pretty good job under extremely difficult circumstances. But with all due respect to Susan, I think that there are things to apologize for. And indeed, with all due respect to Susan, she's not alone in this, by the way, the one thing that worries me most is the prevalence that I have heard in meetings like this among members of the press to be absolutely unwilling to be self-critical and to say, we have nothing to apologize for, we did the best we could, and that's it, thank you very much. Susan is not the only one to have said this, and I have great respect for Susan and for her program. But that, in effect, disturbs me more than anything, because we all have things to apologize for in our work, and as professionals, we constantly have to be self-critical to say, how can we do better the next time? What does the press have to apologize for? What were the shortcomings? Again, my own experience and the report, I think, boil down to maybe 3 points. First of all, there was an enormous emotional involvement of the press with the demonstrators. This led, I think, sometimes to overly sympathetic reporting and even more frequently to overly simplistic reporting of what was going on. Now, obviously, I can't go into a great deal of detail on this, but let me give a few examples. One of the things that has disturbed me most, not just about the reporting at the time, but the way in which the reporting has sort of crystallized since then, is the use of the catchphrase pro-democracy student movement to summarize what was going on. I think that both elements in this are extremely misleading. First of all, to call it a student movement, or to continue calling it a student movement by late May and early June, is to belittle the movement. This was not simply a student movement. This was a mass movement that was drawing participants from all sectors of Chinese urban society, not just from the students. To call it pro-democracy in the same way is to, in a sense, to overly glorify the demands. Since it is not at all clear that the majority of people were concerned about democracy as Americans know it, but rather were concerned with a very wide range of issues, some of which were economic in nature, some of which were political in character, but I'm not sure that they can be summarized very simply and very usefully by the term pro-democracy. And by using the term pro-democracy, by referring to the goddess of democracy, as some did, as the Statue of Liberty, was perhaps unintentionally creating resonances with American culture and American values that simply, in my judgment, were not justified, and that had a very fundamental impact on the way in which Americans perceived things. Secondly, and this is in a sense the overly sympathetic side, is that the report documents, I think extremely effectively, that in some cases the press knew of unflattering information about the demonstrations and chose deliberately not to report them. That, for example, some prominent leaders of the hunger strike were violating the hunger strike, indeed were accepting meals from foreign journalists, that much of the student movement at the core of the demonstrations was extremely hierarchical, factionalized, bureaucratic, in other words, not itself necessarily an epitome of democracy, and that this was not reported because it did not fit the general story that the press wanted to portray. So I think the first criticism can be, again, stated as an overly sympathetic and overly simplistic reporting of the demonstrations. The second charge, which I think the report confirms, is that there was too much reporting of unconfirmed and ultimately inaccurate rumors, many of which helped create very false impressions of the ultimate outcome. One that Shentung has already talked about, and I agree with him as to what difference it makes, is the reporting of the massacre in Tiananmen Square itself, which turns out to have been greatly exaggerated. The second set of rumors that were reported were the reports of an imminent civil war in China, including direct confrontation among the Chinese military. And third, and I think the most dangerous one, was the inaccurate reporting about the imminent victory of Zhao Ziyang in the power struggle just before June 4th. That one was particularly dangerous because it gave a sense, it contributed to the sense of irreversibility of the movement, that I think led expectations to be raised and then so severely to be dashed. And thirdly, and the one here that I still have trouble in sorting out, but I'll still put it forward to you as something that I'm concerned about, is the volume of news coverage, especially in the electronic media, relative to depth. The report indicates how this story dominated the news media, both print and electronic, during this period of time. It is comparable, as the report says, to a moonshot, at least an early moonshot, to a presidential convention, but the difference is it went on for days and weeks and months rather than for a discrete and relatively brief period of time. Much of this, of course, electronically, was broadcast live in real time, which is the equivalent, in my view, of simply having newspaper reporters publish constant special editions of their raw notes. That is, you are putting out relatively undigested information in a constant stream in real time. And my concern is that the amount of depth and perspective and context that was being provided during this extraordinary time period of coverage was simply inadequate. And this was coupled with the fact that in television in particular, images are more powerful, even if they're misleading, than any words at all. And that even if the words had been sufficiently complex and sophisticated and contextual, which they were not, the problem is that the powerful images played and replayed and re-replayed because of the need to fill live airtime gave, I think, an impression and a power that I am still quite concerned about. Though this is the point that I have some hesitation. Haven't come to my own conclusions, but I'd like your thoughts on it. Having said this, let me conclude with the second question, and that is, so what? And here my answer may surprise you. Having said all this, I don't think it made that much difference. Because I don't think that press coverage was the only factor in shaping American policy, American attitudes, or U.S.-China relations. Many foreigners, Chinese, Japanese, other Asians, ask me, in fact it's the most frequent question I get today, is why 2 years after Tiananmen are U.S.-China relations still so bad when every other country is improving its relationship with China? Why is the United States threatening further sanctions? This is a question that foreigners find it very difficult to understand. And in explaining this, I find that I don't really have to talk about distortions in press coverage at all. In fact, I don't even mention it. What I think is happening is, first of all, that there really was a set of reprehensible actions on the part of the Chinese government. And even if you discount all of the distortion and exaggeration and over-emotion, you are still left with a hardcore reality which is absolutely unacceptable. So that the press exaggeration doesn't make that much difference to me. Secondly, I'm persuaded that events in China evolved in a way that was almost tailor-made to create anger and disillusionment. That we had had a period of relatively smooth and seemingly successful reform. That had raised expectations. We then had a period of demonstrations in favor of further political reform, which had raised hopes. We then had a period in which the Chinese government seemed to be totally incapable of deciding how to respond, and then unable to mobilize and implement the repressive force necessary to implement martial law. All of this gave the impression of something that was irreversible. And when finally on June 4th it turned out to be quite reversible, at least in the short run, the expectations which had been raised so high were completely dashed. When the argument is made that in effect it wasn't so much what the media said, but it was what aspects of the coverage the public seemed to remember or seemed to be impressed by. And that's a very important and I think a very, very valid point. That the American public, first of all, was primed, as it has been primed for more than 100 years, to the notion that eager young Chinese wanted to study American values and institutions and to become just like us. A very, very powerful core myth in U.S.-China relations that the demonstrations in Peking reinforced. The American public was also primed by other elements in our traditional views of China for repression, for political controls, for barbarism, for brutality, so that both the good and the bad fed upon and brought out of the American people some very long-standing components of our traditional views of China. At the same time, American policy towards China was rapidly, as some have put it, running out of roadmap. The old strategic rationale of an anti-Soviet united front was clearly invalid. The policy of economic cooperation in China was running against all the obstacles to the China market, and in effect you had a policy that was almost like a cartoon character going out over the cliff, running and kind of going on its own momentum, and then it looks down and sees there's nothing there and it collapses. And that in effect was what the U.S.-China relationship was. It had outlived its rationale, was primed for a fall, and Tiananmen provided that fall. Finally, the last thing that has happened has been that the Bush administration has made, in my view, a whole series of tactical and strategic errors in handling its China policy. And that is the explanation as to why there is still such controversy in the United States today over how to deal with China. So my bottom line is that the press gets about a B+, an A- in my view. It does have some mistakes that it made, but that in the end, the developments in China the way in which they fed into American popular culture and public perceptions of China, and the way in which the Bush administration lagged behind the curve in adjusting policy to take these events into account, this explains a lot more to me than any exaggerations or oversimplifications that the press may have made. Still, the press did play a role. And what's more, both of our press representatives have said that, in effect, the way in which the press covered China was a new prototype for a new kind of coverage of international crises that we are going to see more of. And therefore, I come round to my full circuit to my first point. Whatever the press's responsibility is, still, because this is simply the first case in a new series of press styles in dealing with foreign crises, I think it is very important that the press take a very careful look, draw the appropriate lessons, try to improve, and I really think this report is a very good step in that direction, and the authors, Mike Berlin, Ross Terrell, Akira Irie, and the Barone Center, in my view, are to be congratulated for it.
Thanks, Harry. Our four panelists, I think, have given us a rich and many-sided view of this topic. I'm going to give them a chance to come back at each other, but hopefully they'll do that in conjunction with answering your questions. So let's have some questions from the floor. Would you come to the microphone, either here or up in the balcony, to ask a question? Here's the first one. As briefly put as you can, because we have to watch the clock.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Harding. I agree with a number of the things you said, and one of the reasons, especially the so what example, because I think in some ways this was a very pure example of an event that we don't often have. Things are usually much more complicated than Tiananmen was. But I do think now, 2 years later, what you were implying, and I think the thing that brought me here, is that we are perhaps 2 years late really understanding the real impact of this, and that is what the government understood, probably American government and other governments, as well as including the Chinese, understood right away. And that is why what we're really moving towards is an analysis of how this is going to be a movement towards controlling press coverage, because what we're all talking about is the enormous visual impact of live coverage. And that's what I'd like to hear from the panel, because we've just come out of a Gulf War where we've seen that thinking from the government put into practice.
I'd like to take that. You know, in what Harry was talking about this live pictures all the time, and it was uncensored video, I mean, this was new to us. We were experimenting, and I don't mean to sound arrogant by saying I don't apologize. What I don't apologize for is, while there, we really thought we were doing the best job we could. We didn't have ulterior motives. We've had many conversations subsequent in how we cover things, and do we put people at risk, especially after the example I gave. But the lessons of China told us that not everything has to be live, that occasionally, and in the Gulf War, we very much used that self-censorship, that things that came in, we, aside from the military helping us, we didn't use everything we shot. It was hurtful. It jeopardized some people. So that this was an enormous emotional event. I agree that we were taken with the students. We do suffer superficiality, partially because we are so taken with the picture that's in front of our eyes that we can't step back, that we don't give ourselves the time to be reflective. But I think what's important is that I think we look at China and we say, not everything is live, not everything should be live. Because it can be live doesn't mean you have to give it to them live. I think we learned some lessons out of China. I think the Gulf War showed us that we don't do everything live. I think that the most frustrating thing as a television person and in this live mode was not getting to everything we could get at. I think that some of the great frustration that we had was our own reliance on experts. That when we couldn't get to a government person, we went to the person who we thought was talking to the government person. Was that right? Probably 8% of the time. You know, in retrospect, we've pulled back from using our experts Although the Gulf War, you saw a lot of them, but once we were in the field, we pulled back as soon as you got real information.
Thanks, Susan. Another question?
No,
That didn't really answer my question. You're paying a price now. We all are.
but we're learning. I think that
You're talking at the view of control. You haven't even been allowed any longer to get there to send out the pictures. That's what my question.
But we can. I mean, I went around the military and I got into Kuwait without the military. CBS was the first news crew in. So you can get around. There are ways to get around. You know, are you saying that the government controls us and that we will not be able to allow to feed video? I'm sorry, I'm not.
Well, in some ways, what we're talking about, Mr. Harding brought this up, is that this was the first prototype of a kind of coverage.
Right, right.
And things ahead of us, technologically speaking, are going to make it so much more so that governments, our own governments, are becoming afraid of
What we have the ability to do.
And the media, therefore, this is an opportunity for the media to talk about how they are going to have to start thinking. The government's ahead of us.
We don't have to start thinking, we already have.
Let's move to another question. Anyone up in the... Yes. Could you see a microphone? Oh, we've got one here.
My name is Tamar Shea. I am a sophomore at the college, and I was in Beijing during the demonstrations. This question is directed to Shantong. Could you talk about how the press treated you and the other student leaders after Tiananmen Square? And also briefly, I know that's not the topic of discussion, briefly, if you can, what your opinion about Bush's stance on MFN is?
Well,
First one is more important.
yeah, I will definitely focus on that. You mean during the movement or after, or both?
After.
Actually, I would like to talk about the things during the movement also, because both of our panelists pick up that topic about, you know, how I was interviewed by quite a lot English language TV network, and it did happen. I mean, it was I was amazed because I mean, at that time I was in charge of the first independent student paper during the movement. It's called News Herald. I was really looking up to some journalism I learned from American press, and I was put in this. I have to literally make some gestures, you know, to talk about. I mean, actually, I overheard somebody behind the camera say, "We better get him emotional." You know, and I mean, in the beginning, I was, you know, it's sort of, you know, first time from countryside getting to New York City, you know. I didn't know what I was doing, but later on I find, I mean, do I need to put up with this, you know? I mean, what they're doing, what I'm doing. But afterwards, I mean, it's mainly answering your question. I mentioned that actually, Mr. Harding mentioned that a lot, you know, systematically about the coverage later. Also, I think it's very, frankly, it's very shallow, both on the report of the exile movement and the reflection on the 1989 movement. For my case, which is your question, I had there was an article in the Rolling Stone made a lot of noise about me and another student leader, also quite well known, more well known than me, in the beginning, and basically the title of it, Children from Tiananmen Square, and you know, Shantong and the other students was acting as yin and yang. I mean, they were making me so dreamy. I mean, there are two full-page pictures, you know, Rolling Stone style. You say the other guy is one style, and Shantong is thoughtful, sensitive, and otherworldly. And I mean, it's a new word for me at that time, you know. It was quite helpful for my philosophy class. But I mean, that's the type of thing we got. And unfortunately, that's very beginning. I mean, actually, the writer, I have very high respect to the writer of that article, and is one of my mentors in this country. But unfortunately, that article was in the beginning of our exile life, and it keeps happening at the same level. It just keeps at the same level. And I mentioned actually in my remark about the moving focus away. Actually, it's related to the second question. I mean, I find very difficult after the focus moved away, that our voice can be heard by American people. Though, from our point of view, we should examine ourselves. Do we really understand the political context in this country? Do we really using political and media language in this country? Because after all, we're an exile movement. We're acting in this country, operating politics in this country. But meanwhile, press, often I find, even today, press will still pick me up as one of the student leaders of Tiananmen Square. I established my group for 2 years already, and it's been operating so many programs in this country on Capitol Hill and nationwide and internationally. And still, the press will say, young kid, basically, from Tiananmen Square.
That's because you wrote a very good book on it. Let's move. I think we'll leave MFN to one side. It's not quite our topic. Nick Dunlop, a question?
Yes, I'm interested in the observation that both in the Persian Gulf coverage and in Tiananmen, there is a feeling that there wasn't enough depth or analysis, and there was too much fascination with moving figures and real-time portrayal of what was going on. I'd address this question to the panel, but probably mostly to Susan Zierinski and Jeff Sommer. What is your thinking about what can be done to introduce more depth and analysis when you're working under these conditions of enormously interesting, fast-moving story? Can we actually grow journalists quickly who know the background? After all, journalists are not State Department officials who focus on possible trouble spots and spend years and years preparing possible experts. Aren't you always going to have to draw upon experts?
Yes.
Aren't you going to be always undermined by the competition, which is going to be showing those fascinating pictures which you might not be showing because you're restraining yourself, looking for depth?
Jeff, do you want to start with that?
Susan.
I'll start it, which will give me a chance to answer one of Jeff's points.
I've been waiting for that, actually.
I'll use the word. We did have an expert correspondent who speaks the language in Beijing, but it's a specious argument to say you can't send in an anchor. If there is a major story and you have what is a major reporter and you consider your anchor man a reporter, why not send him in? If the story is of such a depth that you want to focus your coverage on it, why not send the anchorman? Yes, it is a disadvantage that not everybody speaks Chinese at CBS. It's a disadvantage that producers don't speak Chinese. But we have 3 Chinese-speaking producers, which is probably more than many, and we had hired kids, university students, who were fluent Chinese, and some people from other walks of life who were our eyes and ears for people that really needed the language translated, etc. I think it is not realistic in a story of that magnitude to say that you have to be an expert to go in. I've gone into a lot of different countries where I now speak 5 or 6 words in 7 or 8 different languages, but it's a very frustrating thing, and it's probably the most difficult thing we have to do. But part of our job is to be instant experts, to be able to go in, to be a quick study, to surround yourself. I mean, we do have to rely on experts, as much as I hate to do it. We do. We're giving a lot of you jobs, aren't we?
We don't call them experts, we call them specialists.
I want to move along because of the time, but the problem for us is what Nick was talking about is stepping back and taking your breath and giving an analysis. It's easy if you're a print reporter and you have one deadline a day. If you're CBS News and you're servicing this giant, and you know from your years at CNN, there are demands that are almost impossible to meet. What we do is we try to break people off who can take a look at a story, who are not covering it as it's happening, who can do a piece for 60 minutes, a piece for another broadcast, a specialty piece that says, what did this mean? Where is this going? Where is the government? I mean, that's the way that television does it, that you take the chance.
I'll give Jeff a chance to come back at the end. We can perhaps have 2 more questions. Yes, you were next.
Sure. One of the things, I'll pick up on what Chen Tong said, one of the things I've been concerned with was the speed in which the media, especially television, dropped the story once it was over. In other words, it sort of went back to status quo in their coverage of China. In talking to another senior producer at another network at one point in time, he suggested that the reason was primarily due to money, that it was so expensive to continue coverage of that kind in a country that was so hard to broadcast from, etc. I suspect that there may be other reasons, and I'd just like to know what your thoughts are.
I'll try and do it quickly. God, I would have worn my bulletproof vest tonight if I'd known. I think that while cost is a factor, I'd like to be the ethical person that says we will stay with the story. We maintained an enormous office there through July, and as a matter of fact, I think even through August. As a matter of fact, my daily morning communication with New York was, who can you send out of there today after about approximately a month after Tiananmen Square, and every day we would find some excuse not to send people back. So I disagree with you. We maintained an enormous office there, and at some point our visas ran out, and the government itself would not let us maintain that large of a presence in. You know, we are by nature a fickle society, unfortunately. I'd like to be different. I'd like to have the resources to have bureaus in the cities that a year ago we had bureaus in. It's a new time. It's a new time for the world, not just for the media. And we have to really focus on events as they are. We still maintain a bureau in Beijing, I'm happy to report. But it was not for lack of money that we shut down, and I think that CBS had the largest contingent for the length of time and still cares about the story, and we're actually doing the long piece tomorrow night.
One more question here.
Thanks. I'd like to comment on something that Mr. Harding was saying. I did notice the scanty, sort of the scantiness of reporting outside of Beijing, and also of the other kinds of issues that were involved, not just the democracy stuff, but the economic issues. I had friends living in Taiyuan up in Shaanxi, and they were reporting to me when they came back that there were a lot of demonstrations there just about economic issues with people who had not received anything but IOUs for salaries for a very long time. And these issues never came out in the coverage.
I'd like to tell you you're wrong, because part of the advantage of having launched all these people with the Gorbachev, and I'm sorry, but this attacks on us, so...
Okay, I didn't see it, that's why I'm asking.
We had 4 teams of people. We did the economy. We did that story about getting IOUs. As a matter of fact, I smuggled cameras in with some Chinese people and got pictures out of 5 other cities where there were demonstrations in, and I shipped those pictures out. So even when the satellites were operating, because I thought that the Chinese would shut me down, which they did very often. So we did cover a lot of those economic issues as part of the main focus, and I just disagree with you. We
okay,
did.
I guess I was just commenting in the context, as Mr. Harding was saying, that the pro-democracy aspect of the thing was ballooned very, very large, and I don't feel that we really got enough of these other things that came into play, but I'm glad that you feel you did cover it.
We can always be better. I think, as Jeff said, we were so taken with what was in front of our eyes, it was hard to shut our eyes even for a second.
I'm going to give Harry and Jeff a last chance for a comment in a minute, but we'll take a final question.
This is nothing to do with American press, but I want Shang Tong to elaborate what he, in his speech, said about the gap between Chinese press and Western press. Can you elaborate that? I mean, when you say the gap,
that's
what does it mean? How much the Chinese press? You seem to, of course, in context of tonight's topic, you seem to focus on the effect, on the impact of Western press on the student like yourself. But how about the Chinese press? I know it was not a free press, but it had a brilliant, glorious moment. Can you elaborate?
Actually,
on that?
it seems like you're asking 2 questions. One is the Chinese press in China, but actually in my remark I was mentioning Chinese press in this country. So that's the gap I was mentioning. Basically, briefly answer your question is the Chinese press, especially starting from Hong Kong, though a lot of rumor running around, but still a lot more information, a lot more reflections on the movement, and this country's Chinese press picked it up. And I think it's quite convenient for American press just simply at least have some coverage on that, and we don't see a lot in the English press. In terms of Chinese press, it's really a larger question. I think during the movement we did, to our surprise, to everybody's surprise, we did have a free press for relatively saying like a week, and that was very important. I mentioned the foreign press impact about the feedback system, and during that week in the middle of May, we had a real free press in China, so the movement really spread out, and it became not anymore a student movement, it's real nationwide movement.
I'm going to give Jeff Summer a chance for a quick final word.
Thanks. I'd like to respond to a couple of the questions relating to how we in the media ought to be coping with the change in coverage and the development of this sort of instant television coverage of crises and the like. And I have, as you might expect, a different perspective. I think that what we're experiencing is a kind of a media version of Gresham's law with bad money, forcing out good, and that's what happens when you bring in anchor people who don't really know the story, and you end up flooding the air with a great deal of inconsequential but very powerful stuff. I think that television is incredibly powerful, and it is so powerful, the images are so powerful, the ability to create the illusion, at least, of immediacy and of reality is so overwhelming that it's a terrible dilemma. And the dilemma is, I guess, as Nick Daniloff was suggesting, I think, that you basically have to compete with this stuff. I mean, if someone puts something on the screen that is going to grab all the viewers out there, then the other networks have got to do it, and then the print people have got to come to grips with it. And can we respond adequately? I'm not that optimistic. I think that there is a big problem. I don't think we can train enough people. I don't think that the economic situation is very encouraging. I think that what we're seeing now, we're clearly in a kind of transition at this moment with a kind of a shakedown. It's extremely expensive to mount the kind of coverage that people have been seeing in the last few years. It's expensive for television. And as most people know, I guess the advertising environment is not very good for any of the media at this point, including television, and it's certainly true for print. We in print have gone into very kind of massive coverage given our level. Newsday had 7 people in the Gulf area throughout the war, and we were paying very high insurance rates, and it was extremely draining and debilitating. I think that ultimately you're going to see a shakedown. I don't think there are going to be as many players in the game as there are at this moment. I don't think that the networks are going to be able to do what they've been doing. I do think, by the way, again, relating to this bit with the anchors, I think that I would, if you've got people who know what they're doing, then I would let them do it and exert more control. And as far as the print side of it goes, though, having said all of that, nonetheless, we're not giving up. We're doing our best to be analytical, to do, as I say, to do enterprise stories, to acknowledge the fact that when you pick up your newspaper the next day, you're already going to know what the basic news is, unless we've managed through our enterprise reporting to break a story, which we still do, and we try to do as much as we can. But again, in order to be competitive and to do a better job than television, which is already showing you everything in a more powerful way, it means that we've got to have a hell of a lot of people out there, and it's very expensive, and we have to have a hell of a lot of people who know the subject, and that's very difficult, and it's a real conundrum, and I don't think we've solved it.
Harry Harding, a quick final word.
Yeah. We've been talking about the press, the media, as if they were a single entity. And I'd just like to draw some distinctions that may shed some light on things. First of all, again, with all due respect to television, I think that the print media in general, and it's understandable as to why, were able to provide much more depth and context and sophistication in the coverage of Tiananmen. And I think that the report gives some very interesting documentation of that fact. Jeff's point just now that print is going to have to emulate electronic media more and more is therefore an extremely depressing conclusion from my point of view.
I wouldn't say emulate. I think that's not what I'm saying.
Okay. Well, I thought it's what you're saying, and if it's not, I'm pleased, because I think that this distinction between electronic media as sort of headlines and illustrative images and print for more in-depth analysis is a valid one. Secondly, for both print and electronic media, we can draw a further distinction of what might be called the immediate reactive reporting and more reflective retrospective reporting. And I'm thinking, just to cite 2 examples among many, the ABC special on the crisis after it was done, the superb LA Times special insert, special edition on the crisis once it was over. Both of these are extremely good examples of how both forms of media do better, like any of us, when they have time to think things through, do some research, do some retrospective, gain some perspective. And I think that those are positive examples in both media. I think that we do, however, have to come to grips with another issue, or maybe two final questions. First of all, the nature of television as a medium, what kinds of things it can do, what kinds of stories are almost inevitably going to be distorted simply because of the power of visual images. And secondly, the nature of the audience. And I was, again, worried about Nick Danilov's question, which basically, if I understood him correctly, was what happens if one medium tries to add that depth and perspective and everybody changes the channel or buys another newspaper because they don't want to be bored with all of that detail? That is a very, very disturbing question. And I think we do have to at some point come to the question of audience and how prepared they are to sit still for something more than the superficial.
I would like to make very quick comments about the, it's related to the press. We're talking about the press in this panel. I mean, as my nature as a exiled political activist, the most current issue of this, the press is covering related to China is the MFN status. And I think there's really not a lot of argument I want to make because President Bush said it all. But it's sort of like I will steal this phrase from Dr. Terrell that he peeled up the banana skin and get apple out of it. It's I mean all his argument for the MFN status for China in his speech is sound, and his conclusion on conditional renewing is really not a wise decision, I would say. And me and the Exile pro-democracy movement for mainland China I represented very much in a disagreement with him, and we understand very much the importance of free and fair trade for China. Meanwhile, we urge the world we have to look at the serious continuing human rights abuses in China. So the best way to handle it is to conditionally renew the most favored nation status, and the conditions should be focused on basic human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Can the media do better? Can China do better? Can the government here do better? I'm sure these questions will go on being discussed for a long time. Meanwhile, on behalf of the Barone Center, I'd like to thank our panelists, Jeff Sommer, Susan Zierinski, Shen Tong, Harry Harding, and thank you all for coming. Good night.